Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. If you're new here, this channel is about real stories from real people who came to Vietnam looking for something. A fresh start, a second chance, maybe just a life that felt like it fit better than the one they left behind. Some of those stories end well. A lot of them don't. And every now and then, one comes along that stays with you for a while after you've heard it. Today's story is one of those. Gavin Mostert is 54 years old. He's from South Africa originally, spent most of his adult life in New Zealand, and spent 22 years standing in front of teenagers teaching geography and life skills. A man who, by any measure, knew how to read a situation, how to assess it, map it, make sense of where things were headed. That was his job. He was good at it. He came to Vietnam the way a lot of people do, looking for something he couldn't quite name. What he found was a woman, a marriage, a family that welcomed him in, and a life in Da Nang that felt for a while like exactly what he'd been missing. And then something happened that he could not have mapped. Something hiding underneath everything he thought he understood. He's going to tell you about it himself. I'll just say this. The number in the title of this video is not a typo. Stick around. Here's Gavin's story in his own words. Right, so. I taught geography for 22 years. Secondary school, New Zealand state system, mostly in Christchurch. And the thing people don't understand about geography, the thing I always had to explain to parents who thought their kid was just coloring in maps, is that it's actually about systems, how things connect, how water moves through a landscape, how populations shift in response to resources, why certain places develop the way they do and others don't. You're teaching kids to look at something complex and find the logic inside it. I was good at that. In the classroom, I mean. Give me a system and I'll draw it on a whiteboard and make it make sense. I've got this habit, my students used to take the mickey about it, where I'll reach for a pen and start sketching a diagram even in normal conversation. Just can't help it. My brain works that way. What my brain is apparently not built for is reading the systems that operate between people. Specifically, the system operating inside my own marriage. 20 years, 2 daughters. A house in Christchurch with a garden, and I was quite proud of, actually. I'd put a lot of work into that garden. And I missed it, I think, the way you miss something you didn't know you were losing while you were losing it. When it ended, I didn't fight. That's the part one still turnover. My ex-wife got the house, got primary custody of the girls, got half my Kiwi saver, and I signed things. My lawyer at the time kept saying, Gavin, you're leaving money on the table. And I kept saying, yeah, no, it's fine. She can have it. Because I felt guilty. 20 years of being the person who was technically present, but not really there. Teaching other people's kids about drainage basins while my own kids were doing homework at the kitchen table without me paying attention. You can't put that on a balance sheet, so I put it on the settlement instead. Whether that was the right thing to do, I genuinely don't know. I'm 54. I still don't know. The question follows me. After the divorce, I moved into a rented room in a flat in Dunedin. 49 years old at that point, living with a postgraduate student and her boyfriend who were very kind about sharing the bathroom. I had my pension coming in from the school service, not a lot, but steady, and a redundancy payout I'd received when my school restructured and merged with another school, and they discovered they needed one fewer geography teacher. So there's that. The redundancy didn't hurt as much as it should have, which told me something about how I felt about the job by then. The room in Dunedin was fine. Everything was fine. I'd started running again, which I hadn't done since my 30s. I was reading. I was in contact with my daughters. I was texting them, and they were sometimes texting back. I was functional. Genuinely. But there's a kind of okay that is its own specific problem, which is when okay stops feeling like a temporary state and starts feeling like the ceiling. And I was living under that ceiling. This would have been, let me think, about 3 years after the divorce. So late 2021, early 2022 maybe. And I had got into this habit of watching YouTube in the evenings, which is not something I'd ever done before, but the flat was quiet and I'd finished whatever book one was reading and I started watching videos about Southeast Asia. Travel stuff, mostly. Cost of living, that sort of thing. And one evening, I found this video. Bloke from Brisbane, geography teacher, had spent 6 months in Hoi An doing some volunteer teaching work at a local school. And he was talking about it in this very straightforward way. Not gushing, not selling anything, just saying it was the first time in a while he'd felt genuinely useful, that the classroom there had reminded him why he'd gotten to teaching in the first place. I watched that video 4 times. Same night, I told my mate Brendan I was thinking of taking an extended holiday. A few months maybe, just to see a bit of Southeast Asia while I was still young enough to get on and off a motorbike without embarrassing myself. He said that sounded sensible. I told myself I might look into whether there was a curriculum angle. Maybe something about monsoon systems or coastal development for a unit I was no longer employed to teach. My brain is very good at providing itself with respectable reasons for things. The truth was simpler. I was 52 years old, sitting in a rented room in Dunedin on a Wednesday night, and a man I'd never met was describing a life on a screen that felt more like mine than my actual life did. And I thought, well, what exactly is stopping me? The answer, when I checked, was nothing. There was genuinely nothing stopping me. I booked the flights in February. I landed in Da Nang in March. I had about 95,000 New Zealand dollars saved. The Dunedin flat I left in the hands of a rental agency, that room would keep generating a bit of income while I was gone. The pension continued. I wasn't rich. But I wasn't worried either. I'd run the numbers. I knew what things cost in Vietnam, roughly. I had a spreadsheet. Of course I had a spreadsheet. I watched that video one more time the night before I left. The Brisbane teacher. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man who'd found a speed that suited him. I wanted that. I knew that's what I wanted. I just didn't let myself say it out loud. 4 times I watched it. That's when I knew I was going. Da Nang hits you like a warm, wet hand to the face. That's the only way I can describe it. I stepped out of the terminal and the air it pressed in. Thick, heavy, smelling of diesel and something floral underneath that I couldn't identify and still can't. It was 10 in the morning and already 30 degrees. I stood there with my 2 bags and my carry-on and I thought, right, here we go then. The guest house I'd booked was in Mai An, not far from my K Beach, in the part of the city where a lot of the long-term foreigners seem to settle. I'd chosen it deliberately. I'd told myself I wanted to be immersed, to be in a local neighborhood, but honestly, I wanted to be somewhere I could find an English-speaking person if I needed one. There's no shame in that. I was 52 and I'd never been further than Bali. You start where you start. The first 2 weeks were just, I don't know how to explain it without sounding slightly mad. It was like being a student again. Everything required effort. Ordering coffee required effort. Getting from A to B required effort. The traffic alone could occupy your entire attention for minutes at a time. The motorbikes coming from every direction, the logic of it completely opaque at first, and then slowly, you start to see the pattern. The flow of it. There is a system. It just doesn't look like one from the outside. I started taking motorbike lessons from a bloke at the guest house who charged 200,000 dong per session, about 13 New Zealand dollars, and who was extraordinarily patient given that I fell off twice in the first lesson and once more in the third. Second fall, I managed to take out a row of plastic stools outside a Bun Bo Hu place. The owner came out, looked at me on the ground, looked at the stools, looked at me again, and then started laughing. I gave her 50,000 dong and she waved me off like I was a minor inconvenience. I thought, I could live somewhere that responds to disaster like that. I found a coffee spot I liked near the Tran T. Lee Bridge, one of those open-fronted places with condensation on the floor and plastic stools that are about 30 centimeters off the ground, which takes some adjustment when you're a tall man with bad knees. Chape Suaja iced coffee with condensed milk, which is not something I'd have ordered in a previous life, but which I now consider one of humanity's genuine achievements. I went there every morning. I had my phone app open on the table, the one for learning Vietnamese, and I'd go through the tones with my color-coded notes and then try whatever I'd learned on the woman who ran the place. She corrected me every time, always with the same slightly pained expression. But she also always refilled my coffee without being asked. I decided to take that as encouragement. The expat community was hard to avoid. There were a fair few of them in the places I gravitated toward. Restaurants around Quang Dieu, the bars near An Thuong. Mostly men in their 40s and 50s, some retired, some working in construction or logistics or teaching English. Some of them were good company. Some of them had that slightly fixed quality that I recognized. The quality of men who have decided that a comfortable grievance is easier to carry than a difficult hope. There was a bloke I met a few times at a bar on An Thuong 4, I won't use his name, who had been in Da Nang for 4 years and whose conversation had basically narrowed to three topics. How great Vietnam was in 2015, how everything had changed since, and his ex-girlfriend who had, depending on the night, either stolen from him outright or simply taken advantage of his generosity. Both things seemed possibly true. He was friendly and I liked talking to him, but I think this is honest, I used him as a reference point for what I didn't want to become. That sounds unkind. It was probably just self-protective. I was aware of the stories. You can't do any research on Vietnam before you go without encountering them. The forums are full of them. Western man, Vietnamese woman, money disappearing in stages. I'd read enough to feel like I understood the shape of it. I was watching for that shape. I was careful. Which is, yeah, exactly what you'd expect a person to say. The language exchange evening was at a place called Kong Cha Fei on Bok Jang, right along the Han River, about 3 weeks after I arrived. Someone at the guest house mentioned it. The format is simple enough. Vietnamese locals wanting to practice English, foreigners wanting to practice Vietnamese, and you get paired up or sit in small groups and take turns stumbling through each other's languages while drinking overpriced coffee. It's a bit awkward for the first 20 minutes, and then it's fine. I sat with a group of four at first, two young Vietnamese men studying engineering, a French woman who'd been in Da Nang for a year, and a woman named Lynn who worked in administration at one of the big hotels near the beach. The engineering students were enthusiastic, but their English was still at the stage where every sentence required negotiation. The French woman and I ended up doing most of the English side conversation, which wasn't really the point, but there you go. Lynn was quiet for the first half hour. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was precise. That's the word I keep coming back to. Precise. She chose her words carefully, not because her English was poor. It wasn't. It was quite good. But because she seemed to believe that saying the right thing mattered more than saying something quickly. That's not a quality you encounter all that often. At some point, we got into the topic of weather. I don't remember exactly how. And I did the thing I always do. I reached into my bag, found a pen, picked up a paper napkin from the table, and drew a quick sketch of the water cycle. Evaporation, condensation, precipitation, runoff. I was explaining why Da Nang gets its heaviest rain in October and November. The other conversations at the table had moved on, and it was just me and Lynn and my napkin diagram. And she was leaning forward slightly looking at it. And then she looked up and said she'd never had anyone explain weather to her like she was a student. I said I was a teacher. Geography. She said she could tell. There was something in the way she said it. Not flirtatious, not performative, just accurate. An observation. I thought about it on the walk home. She had paid for her own coffee. I noticed that. I know how that sounds, like I was running a checklist. I was. A bit. She paid for her coffee and she didn't ask me anything personal. And when the evening ended, she said it was nice to meet me in a way that didn't invite or exclude a follow-up. The sequencing felt right. I appreciated the sequencing. I walked back along the river. The Han was black and lit up with the bridge reflections, and there were couples on the promenade and a few food carts still open, and someone somewhere playing something on a speaker that I couldn't quite identify. I didn't feel lonely, exactly. That's the thing. I just felt aware of the quality of the evening in a way that I hadn't felt aware of anything in quite some time. We exchanged numbers before I left the cafe. It was quick, practical, no ceremony. She messaged the next morning. Just a question. Would I be at the language exchange the following week? Simple. No punctuation she didn't need. I told myself that was nothing. A polite follow-up. A social formality. I told myself that for about 30 seconds. Then I put the phone down and went to make coffee and thought about something else because I knew from the speed at which I'd picked up that notification that it wasn't nothing. I told myself that was nothing. I knew it wasn't nothing. We met for coffee the following Sunday. Her suggestion, her timing, she named a place on Tran Pu, a small cafe I hadn't been to, with wooden stools and a ceiling fan that worked about 60% of the time. She was already there when I arrived, which I noted. Punctual people notice other punctual people. We talked for 2 hours. About her work at the hotel, about my years in Christchurch, about the particular challenge of Vietnamese tones for people whose home language doesn't use them. She found my color-coded vocabulary notes genuinely funny in a way that wasn't unkind. She asked good questions, and she didn't fill silences unnecessarily. I found that I don't know how to put this without it sounding like a diagnosis. I found it restful to be in a conversation that didn't require me to perform anything. She picked up the bill before I could, said she'd suggested the place. I thought, this woman has principles about things. I found that attractive, actually. We met again the next weekend. Walk along the river, no particular destination. Then, the weekend after, dinner at a Quan Nao near her apartment building in Puok Mai. Plastic tables, a ceiling strung with bare bulbs, grilled pork skewers, and 333 beers so cold it sweated through the bottles. She taught me how to say cheers properly, which in the South is just a loud, enthusiastic fan tram, and then you drain it. I was not good at draining a full glass quickly. She was. I noted that too, but not in the way I should have. The pace was hers, not mine. And I kept noticing this, that she set the tempo and that the tempo was measured. Not slow exactly, just considered. Every step felt like a choice she'd made deliberately rather than an impulse she'd followed. In my experience, that's either a sign of character or a sign of something else, and at the time I read it exclusively as character. She told me things about herself gradually, in installments. Her family were from a village about 30 kilometers outside Quang Ngai City. Her father had farmed rice and some vegetables for most of his working life, now retired. An older brother, Min, who lived with his wife and 3 kids in the same province. She was the one who'd made it to the city, gotten qualifications, built something separate. She spoke about her family with a kind of steady affection that wasn't sentimental. She loved them. They were not perfect. Both things were present when she talked about them, and she didn't try to resolve the tension. I found that honest. I was keeping notes. I'm not embarrassed to admit it. Well, maybe slightly embarrassed. But I kept a journal in those months, and I was writing in it. Impressions, observations. The kind of thing a geography teacher does when he's trying to understand new terrain. And what I kept writing was, no urgency, no requests, no emergencies. I had a whole column in my head, practically, of things that hadn't happened yet. Hadn't asked for money, hadn't mentioned anything that required immediate fixing, hadn't steered conversations toward my finances. The ticks kept accumulating in the right places, and I felt, if I'm honest, a little pleased with myself. Like my due diligence was working. Like I was being careful in a way that was going to protect me. I think about that journal now, the confidence of it. About 4 months in, we were sitting outside a little cafe near her hotel. She'd finished an afternoon shift. I'd been doing Vietnamese study, and she mentioned her mother's health. Not in a way that was dramatic, more the way you'd mention the weather. Matter of fact, her mother had kidney disease, had been managing it for a few years, was now on dialysis 3 times a week at a hospital in Quang Ngai City. The cost per session was 3.5 million dong. I did the math. That's roughly 230 New Zealand dollars a session, 3 times a week. Around 2,700 a month. She and her brother were splitting it between them, but Min had 3 children and his own pressures. She said this without self-pity. She didn't look at me when she said the numbers. She was looking at her coffee. She didn't ask me for anything. I want to be very clear about this because I think it's the important part of what happened next. She told me about the situation, and then she moved on to something else. I sat with the information for several days. I thought about it. I did what my life skills students would recognize as weighing up a decision. I looked at what I knew, I looked at the figures, I looked at the context, and I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be. I taught life skills for 22 years. Actual life skills, the curriculum subject, decision-making, relationships, financial literacy, values clarification. I believed in it. I still believe in it. And one of the things I taught, genuinely, was that you can tell a lot about a person's values by what they do when they have the option to help and no one is asking them to. So when I offered to contribute to her mother's dialysis costs, I think this is true, I was acting according to something I actually believed. It wasn't entirely about Lynn. Some of it was about who I thought I was. She said no the first time. Said it wasn't his problem. I said I knew it wasn't a problem, I just wanted to help. She said no again, more firmly. I left it for a week and then raised it once more, and she looked at me for a moment in a way I couldn't entirely read. And then she said, "If you're sure." And I said I was sure. We set it up simply. About 40 million dong a month, roughly 2,700 New Zealand dollars, going toward the dialysis. Her brother would continue his share. I was filling a gap, not carrying the whole weight. Over the next 5 months, that came to around 8,000 New Zealand dollars all up. I thought of it the way I told myself I thought of it. The cost of being a decent human being. But there was the other thing too, underneath that. The thing I was less ready to name. Every time I transferred that money, I felt included. Like I had a role. Like I was not just a tourist in her life, but someone with a function in it. Someone whose presence altered the situation for the better. After 3 years of feeling surplus to requirements in Dunedin, I cannot tell you how much that mattered to me. More than I knew how to say. More probably than was entirely healthy. The relationship just deepened, not dramatically. There was no single moment of declaration. She started telling me things earlier in the day rather than waiting for our weekends. I started factoring her schedule into mine without thinking about it. When I got a bad cold in month 5 and stayed in the guest house for 3 days, she came by with congee from a place near her work and sat with me while I ate it, and then went back to her shift. I'd been ill alone for 3 years in Dunedin. The difference was, I don't have a diagram for that. At some point, I stopped assessing. I can't tell you exactly when. It's like asking when you fell asleep. You can't identify the moment, only that at some point you were awake and then you weren't. I was watching the relationship from the outside, running my mental checklist, and then I was simply in it. The checklist was still there, technically. I just stopped referring to it. You don't notice the exact moment the water stops going one way and starts going another. You just look back later and realize it already happened. I'd been reading about Vietnamese family structure before I went to Quang Ngai. Of course I had. I'm a geography teacher. Well, was a geography teacher. And when I encounter something I don't understand, my first response is to go and find sources. So I knew, in the intellectual sense, about filial piety. I knew that in Vietnamese culture, children, especially daughters, especially eldest daughters, carry genuine obligations toward their parents that go well beyond what most Westerners would consider normal. I knew that a foreigner entering a Vietnamese family enters into a set of expectations that aren't spoken directly but are absolutely present. I knew all of this. I thought knowing it meant I was prepared for it. That's the gap I keep coming back to. The visit to the village happened about 7 months after we met. We took the overnight sleeper bus from Da Nang, and about 6 hours, vinyl bunks, a tinny speaker playing something nobody had chosen, and arrived at the family's house in the early morning. The house was single-story concrete rendered white, set back from a dirt lane, with a corrugated iron roof and a small covered terrace where chickens moved around under a wooden bench. Banana palms at the edge of the property. The smell of incense from somewhere inside. Lynn's father, Ong Bean, was waiting on the terrace. He was a compact man about 70, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time working outdoors. He looked at me for a moment, carefully, without any expression I could name, and then he gave a small nod and said something to Lynn in Vietnamese that I didn't catch. She said later he'd told her I looked like a patient man. I have no idea if that was a compliment or an assessment, probably both. The mother, Ba Huang, was different. She was small and clearly unwell. You could see the dialysis in how she moved, the careful way she managed her energy. But she smiled at me immediately and took both my hands in hers and said something that Lynn translated as, "You came a long way." It wasn't meant geographically, I understood that. And I stood there in that covered terrace with chickens wandering past and this woman holding my hands. And I thought, yeah, I did. I came a long way. I met a lot of people that day. The brother Min and his wife and their 3 children, aunts and cousins whose names I couldn't hold, a neighbor who appeared at lunchtime and stayed for 3 hours, and Lynn's youngest sister, Ngan, 19, round-faced, studying accounting in Da Nang, home for the weekend. She shook my hand very formally and then spent most of the meal on her phone, which I recognized as the behavior of a teenager who had been told to be on best behavior and was managing it minimally. The meal was enormous. Lynn's mother had clearly been cooking since early morning. Bun bo hue, braised pork ribs, pickled vegetables, steamed rice, something with lotus root that I didn't recognize but ate 3 helpings of, There was warm bia ja nang and a bottle of something clear that the father poured into small glasses without explanation. I drank one glass. He refilled it immediately. I drank that one too. He nodded. I think we understood each other. I sat at that table and I thought, this is real. The food is real. The mother's hands were real. This family, with all their complications and obligations and 3 children under 8 running around the dirt lane outside, is real. And somewhere underneath the thinking, I was aware that I had not sat at a family table in a meaningful way since Christchurch. That the last time I'd been part of a meal like this, chaotic, warm, slightly too loud with small children and old people and everyone talking across each other, was in a different life. I missed it in ways I hadn't articulated even to myself. In the car back to the city that evening, Lynn had arranged a grab driver, a long trip. I fell quiet, and she didn't push me to talk. We were about an hour in when I realized I'd been crying very quietly, looking out the window at the dark fields going past. I told her it was the rice wine. She didn't believe me. She was kind enough not to say so. We moved in together the following month. Practically speaking, it made sense. We were spending most nights in the same place anyway, and splitting costs meant my savings were drawing down much more slowly. My savings at that point were around 73,000 New Zealand dollars, which felt, when I checked, like a perfectly healthy position. I noted it, felt fine. The marriage conversation is harder to reconstruct. I'm not sure who said the word first. I think it might have been me, which is, well, that's something I sit with. What I remember is that it didn't feel like a proposal so much as an acknowledgement of something that had already been decided. Like we were both reading from the same map, and at some point we both looked up and said, this is where we are. The civil ceremony at the Da Nang People's Committee was brief and slightly comic. A lot of paperwork, some waiting, a room with strip lighting and a laminated Vietnamese flag, 2 witnesses who were also processing their own documents and seemed mildly inconvenienced by our presence. We signed things. We shook hands with an official who smiled at us with practiced warmth. And then we were married. The celebration in the village 2 weeks later was something else entirely. Plastic chairs and round tables set out in the lane, a borrowed generator for the lights, food that arrived in waves for about 4 hours. Lynn's mother wore a new ao dye in deep red and looked, for that day, like a woman who was not ill. The father made a short speech that Lynn translated for me afterward, 1 sentence at a time. It was not sentimental. It was a list, essentially. His daughter had worked hard, she had chosen well, the family was glad. That was it. I thought it was the most dignified thing I'd ever heard. The total cost for the ceremony fees, travel, gifts for the family, and the celebration meal came to just over 14,000 New Zealand dollars. I paid nearly all of it. I did so the way you pay for something when you've already decided the price is acceptable before you see the figure. It wasn't a transaction. It was an act of belonging. That's what I told myself, and I believe that was true. I applied for a spousal visa extension, 5 years as a spouse of a Vietnamese citizen, renewable. The process required documentation from New Zealand, some of which had to be apostilled, all of which took longer than any official suggested it would. 3 trips to the immigration office, the usual, but it got done. And then I was a married man in Da Nang, with a spousal visa in my passport, and a family in Quang Ngai who called me An Gavin. They could never quite get the V. And a wife who came home from the hotel in the evenings and cooked or suggested we go find something to eat from the carts along Hoang Dieu. I had a role, a proper one. I was someone's husband and someone's son-in-law, and someone whose presence at the table actually altered the arithmetic of things. That was the best I'd felt in years. Probably the best I'd felt since before the marriage ended in Christchurch. That's the thing I keep turning over. The feeling was real. Whatever else was happening underneath it that I didn't know about yet, the feeling was real. The renovation came up the way things do when you're married and you've become part of a family's calculations. Not as a demand, more as a fact of the situation that eventually required acknowledgement. Lynn's parents' house in the village, and the same house where we'd had that first meal where Ba Huang had held my hands on the terrace, had a roof that leaked in 3 places and plumbing that was, in the Vietnamese provincial sense, functional, which meant there was water. But the bathroom situation was difficult for an older woman managing a serious illness. The tiles were cracked. The kitchen had no proper drainage. These were not exaggerated problems. I'd seen the house. I knew what it needed. I want to be precise about how the conversation happened because I think the mechanics of it matter. Lynn didn't ask me to fund a renovation. What happened was that she mentioned the roof, mentioned that Min had been getting quotes, mentioned that the quotes were more than Min could cover right now. And then she stopped talking about it. No pause for my response. No look that said, well, I sat with that for a few days, and then I said, what would it cost to do it properly? Not just the roof, but the whole thing. Plumbing, bathroom, floor tiles, the works. She told me the builder's estimate was around 330 million dong. I did the calculation. That was approximately 22,000 New Zealand dollars at the exchange rate that week. And I said, let's do it. There's a legal reality I was aware of and accepted completely. Foreigners cannot own land in Vietnam. The property titles, the So Jo, the Red Book, those go to Vietnamese citizens only. The house would be renovated in Ba Huang's name. I wasn't putting it in Lynn's name, which at least felt like caution. Her mother's name. An elderly woman with kidney disease. It seemed stable. It seemed like the least risky version of an arrangement that had no perfectly safe version. I had researched this. I accepted it. I visited the site twice during construction. The builder was a cousin of Lynn's. Lynn had a great many cousins, which I'd come to understand is simply how Vietnamese families work, the cousin network extending outward in every direction. And his crew were efficient. Concrete going up, new roofline, a proper bathroom with a raised floor and a handrail for Ba Huang. I took photographs and made notes in my project journal. The geography teacher, managing a project. I felt in control. The variables were known, the budget was tracked, the work was visible and solid. 22,000 New Zealand dollars. That brought my total spending to roughly $44,000 since I'd arrived. My savings sat at around $49,000, which was just over half of what I'd brought. I checked the figure, felt manageable. The Dunedin room was still generating rental income, about 1,100 New Zealand dollars a month after agency fees, and the pension kept coming. I was living comfortably on well under 1,500 a month in Da Nang. The math still worked. I sent photographs of the completed renovation to my daughters in Christchurch. New bathroom, new roof, the terrace repainted. I'm not entirely sure what I thought the photographs would communicate. That I was useful, perhaps. That I had done something concrete with my time and money that a person could point at. Neither of my daughters replied. I waited about 10 days. Nothing. I put my phone down and went and made a coffee and didn't think about it too hard. The second year of the marriage settled into a routine that I found genuinely satisfying. Our apartment was on the fourth floor of a building on a narrow hem off Ngo Quyen, close enough to the river to hear motorbikes on the bridge late at night. I'd picked up some informal tutoring work. 3 expat kids whose parents needed English homework help. Cash in hand, nothing formal enough to require a work permit. It got me out of the apartment on weekday mornings and gave me something to prepare for, which it turns out I need. Lynn worked her shifts at the hotel. We cooked together on weekends sometimes, or went to a place on Tran Phu that did a very good com tam. We were a married couple with a routine. I hadn't had a routine that involved another person in 4 years. I had forgotten how much weight a routine can hold. The first anomaly I noticed was in the household account. We'd opened a joint account at a local bank shortly after the marriage, which in practice meant Lynn opened it in her name with me as a co-signatory because that's how the banking worked for a foreign national. I transferred money into it each month for household expenses. In the first year, the outgoings tracked predictably: rent, utilities, food, the occasional medical top-up for Ba Huang's dialysis. I knew what things cost. Sometime in the second year, I started seeing cash withdrawals that didn't correspond to anything I could account for. Not large, 2-3 million dong at a time. Maybe 6 or 8 million across a month. $30 to $50 a withdrawal. The kind of amounts that vanish into daily life without explanation. I noted them. I told myself, Vietnamese households are cash-based in ways that New Zealand households aren't. You can't expect everything to be traceable. That's a cultural difference, not a problem. I told myself that a lot. Lynn started coming home later than her shift schedule suggested. Twice in 1 week, then more often. Hotel work has irregular hours. Guests arrive late. Administrative problems don't resolve on schedule. I knew this from her and from the other expats whose partners worked in hospitality. I noted the pattern. I told myself it was over time. She didn't mention it. I didn't ask directly. The Vietnamese habit of resolving small complications without bothering a partner, I understood that too, intellectually. And then there was Hung. He appeared for the first time about 14 months into the marriage, a man Lynn referred to as a cousin, which, as I've said, covered a wide range of relationships in her family's network. He came to the apartment once, stayed 15 minutes, left. Another time I saw him waiting on a motorbike outside her hotel when I passed nearby on my own bike. And one evening he arrived while I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my Vietnamese practice. And Lynn came out of the bedroom, saw him through the intercom, said something brief, went downstairs. She was back in 20 minutes. When I asked who it was, she said, "My cousin." About money for the family, I said, "Okay," and I went back to my vocabulary list. I think about those moments now, not with anger exactly, more with the particular frustration of watching yourself choose, each time the explanation that required the least investigation. Hung was a cousin. The cash withdrawals were cultural. The late nights were overtime. Each explanation was not impossible. I stacked them up and called the pile reasonable. I started keeping closer records. Not because I was suspicious, I told myself. Just habit. I'm a teacher. I keep records. But the records weren't reconciling. Columns that should have balanced weren't balancing. I built a spreadsheet, color-coded, monthly, itemized, and the gap between what went in and what could be accounted for kept sitting there, refusing to become smaller no matter how generously I interpreted the categories. I'd been building a picture for months without admitting what I was looking at. The spreadsheet just made it impossible to keep not seeing it. I showed Lynn the spreadsheet on a Tuesday evening. She'd just come home from the hotel. I remember the smell of the air-conditioned lobby she always carried in on her clothes, that particular synthetic cool. And I had the laptop open at the kitchen table and I said, "Can we look at something together?" I walked her through it the way I used to walk students through a piece of work I was concerned about. Not accusatory. Careful. Here's what came in. Here's what I can account for. Here's the gap. The gap across 6 months was around 85 million dong, roughly 5,500 New Zealand dollars that had moved through the household account with no corresponding expense I could identify. She looked at the screen for a while. Then she said the figures were approximate. She said I was being controlling. She went to bed. I sat at that table for a long time. The fan was going. Motorbikes outside. Somewhere down the hem, someone was watching television with the volume up. And one had the spreadsheet in front of me and the particular feeling of having just been told that 2 plus 2 does not equal 4 by someone who seemed very certain of it. I didn't push. I told myself she was stressed. I told myself I'd raise it again when the moment was better. The moment did not come because the following Saturday, Ngan arrived. Lynn was on a morning shift. I was having coffee at the kitchen table working through my Vietnamese practice when the intercom buzzed. I pressed the button. A voice said, "Aunt Gavin, La Ngan Jai." It's Ngan. She was 19. She'd been at that first family meal, the one who'd shaken my hand very formally and spent the rest of the day on her phone. She was studying accounting at a college in Da Nang. I hadn't seen her since the wedding. She sat down at the kitchen table where I'd shown Lynn the spreadsheet 4 days earlier. She had her phone in both hands. She put it on the table and she didn't look at it. And she didn't look at me either, just at the middle distance, and she said in English, "I think you should look at what Lynn owes to Hung." I had learned by then that Hung was a cousin, a family member, someone who sometimes needed things sorted. Ngan showed me her phone. A Zalo message chain, her and Lynn, going back 18 months. She scrolled slowly, translating as she went in a flat, careful voice. Card games, Tien Len, she too. Back rooms. She didn't say where exactly, just described them as places behind other businesses, places Lynn went in the evenings after her shift ended. Losses that accumulated. A man named Hung, not a cousin, not any kind of family, a man who ran his lending operation out of a phone repair shop near Chohan, the old market. A man who lent money to people who had nowhere else to go. She kept scrolling. The messages went on. The numbers in them went up. And then she stopped at a particular exchange and she said, "This is the amount now. 1.8 billion dong." I read it. I looked at her. I asked her to say the conversion again. She said, 145,000 New Zealand dollars, give or take. I sat with that number for a long time. It was larger than what I'd brought to Vietnam. It was larger at that exchange rate than my total savings had ever been. Lynn had been accumulating this debt for the better part of 2 years, at least some of which predated our marriage and the money moving through our household account, the amounts I couldn't account for, the small withdrawals, the transfers to numbers I didn't recognize, had been servicing the interest, keeping Hung from escalating while she hoped, presumably, that something would resolve. I asked Ngan why she was telling me. She looked at me then, properly, for the first time since she'd sat down. She said, "Because she will ask you to pay it. And then Hung will have more. And she will play again." She left about 20 minutes later. I didn't ask her any more questions. I didn't have the right questions yet. The next morning, I was at the bank when it opened. I'd found a translator through an expat forum the night before, a retired teacher available by the hour. We sat together at a desk and went through 12 months of statements, line by line. The translator was a quiet man who did not comment on what we were looking at. He just worked. And what emerged from the working was a pattern so clear that I felt, perversely, the small professional satisfaction of watching a system reveal its own logic. Withdrawals in amounts just under the threshold that would flag for review. Transfers to 3 different accounts, none of them in names I recognized, spaced to avoid regularity. Not random. Structured. Someone had given thought to how to do this without triggering the obvious signals. She'd been using our household money to pay the interest on a gambling debt for most of our marriage. The dialysis money, the $8,000 I'd given before we married, that had been real. Ba Huang's kidney disease was real, but the financial architecture of everything after that had been built, in part, around keeping me solvent and available. I went home in the early afternoon. Lynn was back from her shift. She saw my face, and I think she understood from my face that the conversation we were about to have was different from the spreadsheet conversation. She sat down. She didn't deny it. That's the part one want to be clear about. She didn't invent an alternative explanation. She said yes. She said the gambling had started 2 years before we met, during a period of... She used the word pressure, which I didn't pursue. She said she had intended to stop. She said she had believed genuinely that she could manage the debt without me ever knowing. She said she loved me, and she said, I think she meant it. I'm not in a position to know, but I think she meant it. She asked me to pay Hung. She said she was frightened of what would happen if I didn't. I do not doubt that the fear was real. I didn't say anything. Not because I was composing a response, but because there wasn't one that fit the moment. I looked at her and I thought, 2 things can be true. She could love me and have done this. Both things could be simultaneously genuinely true. And the fact that both were true made the whole situation worse, not better, because it left me with nothing clean to hold on to. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the spreadsheet still open on the laptop, and I stayed there until the sky started getting light over the Sun Tra Peninsula, and the first motorbikes of the day started on the bridge. By the time the sun came up, I knew what I was going to do. I wasn't happy about it, but I knew. The first thing I did that morning was find a lawyer. There was a name I'd seen recommended on an expat forum several months earlier. A Vietnamese-Australian man who'd been practicing in Da Nang for about 12 years, handled a lot of foreigner cases. I messaged him at 7 in the morning. He replied by 8. We met at his office on Le Duan that afternoon. 800 New Zealand dollars for the consultation and initial advice. I paid it without hesitation. It was the most useful $800 I've ever spent. His assessment was methodical and, in its way, a relief. The debt, 1.8 billion dong, was accrued entirely in Lynn's name. I had no legal liability for it. My exposure was the joint bank account, which still had approximately 12 million dong in it, about 800 New Zealand dollars. He advised me to close it immediately. I did it the next morning, 48 hours after Ngan had sat at my kitchen table. I stood at the bank counter and closed the account and walked out into the Da Nang traffic and stood on the pavement for a few minutes watching motorbikes go past. I didn't feel relief exactly, more like the particular exhaustion of finishing something that was never supposed to have to be finished. I moved out of the apartment 2 days after that. There was no dramatic exit. Lynn was at work. I packed 2 bags, the same 2 bags I'd arrived with, and left the key on the kitchen table next to the laptop that still had the spreadsheet open on it. I thought about closing the laptop. I left it. I filed for divorce the following week. The Vietnamese process for a foreign national is, in the nicest possible interpretation, bureaucratically thorough. Paperwork submitted to the People's Court, a mandatory period of mediation, which in practice meant one meeting with a court official at which both parties confirmed they wished to proceed. An appearance required. The whole process took 7 months and cost 2,400 New Zealand dollars in legal fees. I waited it out in a rented room in a different part of the city, near my quay, close to the beach, a place I'd never lived before. I kept a low routine. Coffee, Vietnamese practice, which I kept up partly out of stubbornness, running along the beachfront in the early mornings when it was still cool. I spoke to Ngan once more during those 7 months. A brief call, practical. I wanted to confirm that the divorce proceedings had been formally initiated and that she should let the family know. She said she understood. I said thank you. She said, I'm sorry, Ange Gavin. I said, I know. That was the last time I spoke to anyone from Lynn's family. I never heard from Hung. I don't know what happened to Lynn's debt. I don't know if she found a way to repay it, or what form Hung's consequences took when she couldn't. I made a deliberate decision not to know. It's one of the few decisions from that period I'm entirely comfortable with. Let me tell you what I lost, because I think being specific about it is more useful than being vague. $8,000 for Ba Huang's dialysis. That was real and I don't regret it. $14,000 for the wedding and associated costs. $22,000 for the house renovation, which is now a better house with a proper bathroom in Quang Ngai province, in the name of an elderly woman I genuinely liked. $8,000 in household costs across 2 years that included real groceries and real utilities, and a portion I now know was servicing a gambling debt. $3,200 in legal fees. Total, somewhere around 55,000 New Zealand dollars. The video title says 120,000. Yeah, I know. The 145,000 was Lynn's debt in total. I did not pay it. My direct loss was 55,000. The title refers to the full exposure I faced, not what I actually lost. I am not entirely comfortable with that framing, but I understand why it's the framing. I'm telling you the actual number. I flew home in month 8, back to Dunedin, back to the flat where the rental agency had been managing a room in my absence, the room I'd planned never to need again. The tenant had just moved out as it happened, so I moved back in. Same room, different man. Arguably, Dunedin in June is cold in a way that Da Nang never prepared me for again. I stood in the room the first morning back and thought, this is the exact life I left. Smaller now, financially, but still the same basic room. I don't teach anymore. The redundancy closed that door and the time away confirmed it. I've accepted that. What I do instead, 2 evenings a week, is volunteer at a migrant literacy program at a community center on Cumberland Street. Adults learning to read and write in English. People who've arrived in New Zealand from all over, navigating a country in a language that isn't theirs. The work is the same as the classroom. You find out where someone is. You meet them there. You try to give them something they can use, and then you get out of the way. I'm good at it. I don't need a curriculum for it. My daughters. The elder one texted me the week after I landed. The content of that message is private and will stay that way. I'll just say that it was the most important thing anyone said to me across the entire 2 years. We're in contact now. Carefully, without diagrams. I don't know what we're building exactly, but we're building something, and I'm going slowly because slow is what the situation requires. People ask me sometimes, what's the lesson? What do you tell someone who's about to go to Vietnam, who's lonely and has some money saved, and believes sincerely that they're being careful? Here's what I say. I spent 22 years teaching kids to read maps. Longitude, latitude, elevation, drainage patterns. I could look at a river and tell you where the water was going. Yeah, no, I could not do that with a person. I thought I could, and that's the most expensive mistake I've ever made. Vietnam didn't con me, I conned myself. Vietnam just provided the location. And if you come here to escape something, make sure you know what it is, because it will find you, and it will cost you. That's all I've got. I hope it helps someone. There's a pause here for a moment, and then you're back with me. Gavin's story is not a story about Vietnam. It's not even really a story about Lynn. It's a story about a man who was lonely in a specific and dangerous way. The kind of lonely that is still functional, that goes to work and reads books and runs in the mornings, that looks fine from the outside. That kind of loneliness doesn't make you reckless. It makes you ready. Ready to believe the first person who makes you feel like you matter. Ready to call that feeling wisdom when it's actually just hunger. Lynn had a gambling addiction. That's the clinical reality underneath this story. And addicts exist in every country, in every city, in every language exchange cafe along every river in the world. The specific tragedy here is not that she was Vietnamese, it's that her addiction required money she didn't have. And Gavin arrived at exactly the moment when a man with money and a need to be needed was the most useful thing she could find. Were the family obligations real? Yes. The dialysis was real. The sense that an eldest daughter carries her family's weight, that's not manipulation. That's Vietnamese culture, and it's genuine. In another story, with another woman, those same obligations would have been exactly what they appear to be. The lesson is not, don't help. The lesson is, know your partner's full financial picture before you marry them. Know where the money goes. Keep your assets protected until trust is established across years, not months. And understand, please understand, that feeling seen is not the same as being safe. If you have a story for Inside Vietnam, you'll find the link in the description. All stories are shared with consent and handled with care. No judgment here, just the truth, which is sometimes the most useful thing we can offer each other. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next time.